have the great pleasure to introduce many friends and colleagues through the years. And this one today, I'm thrilled to have Zoe Harcombe. And I want to make sure, is it Zoe or Zoe?
Zoe, yeah.
I thought that was it, but I'm not sure. But so now my followers are a fairly sophisticated group. I mean, they suffer through my tedious going over papers and insist on evidence. And I'm teaching them how to look at papers and learned recently at a conference that any animal work on a particular enzyme didn't replicate in humans. And so I'm also very human-centric in the research that I go over. But I really wanted to have you on early because you go back a ways in terms of looking at this information for diet and health in general. And I hope by the end of this interview, all of my people will follow you and get the information that you're summarizing. So for my people who don't know who you are, and tell us a little bit about who you are, where you're from, how you got involved in nutrition and health.
Okay, brilliant. So my name is Zoe Harcombe. I went to Cambridge University and did maths and economics. So I'm a bit of a numbers person, definitely numbers rather than languages. My interest in this whole field actually started when I was a teenager and my brother was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And that was a real shock to the whole family. I mean, it was, classic juvenile type 1 diabetes. He lost a stone in a couple of weeks. Why it even took 2 weeks to diagnose, I don't know. It was just so obvious. Sending his little sister down to the shop to buy bottles of pop, and no sooner had I taken some home, he'd finished the other ones and he wanted me to take back the bottles to get the money back. I mean, it was just classic. So I would then help him inject. So I would sort of see the equal and opposite of insulin, sugar, glucose. Didn't kind of start studying it then, but it was kind of in the back of my mind. This is all quite interesting. And then my real interest started, I was up at Cambridge University in the late 80s, and people were starting to become more weight aware. So you'd get people looking at 1-calorie drinks, they just come out. And for the younger people in your subscribers, they were truly disgusting. Those first low-calorie drinks, and they were horrible. They would make low-fat yogurts and low-fat, all this low-fat fake food. And again, I didn't make the connection at the time with, the US dietary guidelines and Senator McGovern and all, that was going to be down the road. But I did have this sort of interest in obesity. I'd never met anyone who wanted to be obese, and yet it was starting to take off like an airplane. And it's kind of like, why is this going on? I then did what my mum would call a proper job. So I left Cambridge, went into management consultancy, because that's what you do when you don't know a single thing about business. You get charged out of 500 quid an hour to tell someone else what to do with their business. It's just hilarious. But that was what was happening in the 90s. And then had a really nice career. I mean, I worked for Mars, big food. I worked for GSK, big pharma. I worked for the Welsh Development Agency. I've done marketing, training, manufacturing. I've worked all over the world. Had a great first career, ended up as vice president for human resources for big companies, really, really great time. And then sort of when the financial crash hit, 2008, 2009, got an opportunity from the company I was working for at the time. They were going to get rid of quite a few of the more expensive people, which was the management team people. And Andy, my husband, we've been at conferences together. Andy and I went away for a couple of days and look, shall we do this? Shall we take this leap from this lovely, secure, big salary bonus, nice pension, and actually go and do what we really love doing, which is diet, health, trying to help people get better health and so on. So we took the plunge and we've never really looked back. I mean, you never earn what you earned then, but we're just so much happier and more fulfilled. So career 2 has kind of been diet and health, but from the sort of the numbers analytical side. Where is the evidence in nutrition, and why do we tell people to do all these different kind of things? And I guess what I'm most known for now, I do talk at conferences with you and people like us. But then I've also been doing this sort of Monday notice, it's become known. We're going to hit issue 700 this year, which is incredible.
Wow.
I've been doing this since sort of 2010, every Monday. apart from Christmas Day, I do this note, and I just take an academic paper, and it might be, one from last week saying animal protein is rubbish and plant protein is so much better for you. And I just go to the paper and I give you 5 bullets of there's the exact summary, there's the 2,000 words, slightly longer unpack, but I look at it so you don't have to look at it. And then you can, assuage the mother-in-law and not killing your darling boy by giving him red meat and butter. Quite the opposite. So that's kind of what I do now.
Fantastic. Well, it's important, and I always say consider the source of information, especially on the internet these days. And your background is impressive and really kind of explains why you can do such a thorough review of things and spot out the wheat or from the chaff, the good from the weak science. And how did you? So you first got my attention when you were looking at saturated fats, and then you gave me in your PhD thesis a copy, I believe. I have it in my storage somewhere. I'll bring it out when I unpack things. So when you first got into this, you looked at saturated fats and health, right?
Yeah. There was a little bit of background before then. So when I got into this whole kind of thing, because I was fascinated by obesity, and that kind of started at Cambridge and it just didn't go away. I got more and more fascinated as more and more people around me were becoming obese, and more people clearly didn't want to become obese. And I'd actually written a sort of mainstream diet book in 2004, and it was called Why Do You Overeat When All You Want Is to Be Slim? So it was trying to answer that $1 million question kind of thing. And I did that while I was still sort of HR director. And then that did a lot better than I expected, because my publisher said, the average book only sells a couple of thousand copies. So I thought, that's okay. But it sold, a few more than that. And then the publisher said, can you do another one? So I wrote one called Stop Counting Calories and Start Losing Weight. So I was very much interested in the obesity angle. And to understand why something starts happening, something must change. It's the old, the laws of the universe, isn't it? For something to change, something must change. Unless a force is acted upon, it will stay in a sort of stable state. And something was clearly changing. And I remember going back in, because it's the maths, it's the logic, what's going on here, what's the answer to the puzzle. And we didn't eat more and do less, which is what the traditional argument was. We just didn't. You go back and look at the evidence in terms of actual calories reported, and you say, maybe people weren't reporting them faithfully. It's like, yeah, but we're still eating a few hundred fewer than we were before we were obese, and we're doing more. When I was a kid, nobody was doing gym, yoga, aerobics, running up and down on the spot and step machines and all that. Nobody did it. It just didn't happen. So it did make sense. But then I kind of looked back and I said, well, okay, something did change, and that was the dietary guidelines. And that was in 1977. And particularly if you look at the US graph, and you'll know this graph, there's that sort of inflection around 76 to 80, and it just takes off like an airplane. So when you hone in on it and you say, right, what happened there? If we didn't eat more and do less, what did happen? And then you see that there was this summit that was held by Senator McGovern, who of course was a failed presidential candidate, and they kind of want to leave their mark in another way. So he was asked to understand why people weren't getting enough nutrition in the US. So he's kind of look at poverty, and he was like, I'm done with that. I now want to set a diet for the whole of America. I want to really leave my mark. And he really did leave his mark, because he'd been on a Pritikin low-fat boot camp just before he'd come in to preside over this committee. So he was going in with his own personal bias. And, if you'd been eating the standard American diet, and then you go and have a whole food, low-fat, high-carb diet, or whatever, you'll still do quite well in the short term. So he's bringing his bias in. Nick Motton, vegetarian, was working on the committee. He's bringing his bias in as well. So I wanted to understand those dietary guidelines. Why were they introduced? Was the evidence there to introduce them at the time? So in sort of the period, I started my PhD in 2012. So in that sort of period, I guess say 2009 to 2012.
Wait. A full career, and then went back for a PhD.
Yeah. No,
Okay.
so I sort of did that. That's part of career two. So career two is the sort of the nutrition. So
Wow.
2009, when I stopped doing the HR director work, I've been working at like 100 hours a week. So it's like, well, I'm sure I can write for 100 hours a week. And suddenly I had this, 100, it's more than 100,000 words, an obesity book, which was my first sort of, it was much more heavyweight than the diet books. And that really got me interested. And I was looking at things like the 7-country study and Framingham and all these sort of classes. So I was really getting into it. And it's like, okay, so you start a PhD without actually knowing what your PhD question is. That's my experience and my experience of people. So I kind of thought, oh, I'm going to be doing something on the 7-country study. And then as it turned out, the 7-country study was just part of chapter 2, which is your review of the literature. And I realized what I really wanted to understand was, why did we introduce those dietary guidelines? And it takes you right back to the beginning of the 20th century and the Russian pathologists, and they were doing autopsies on men. It was always men who died suddenly. They didn't even really know the term heart attack until about 1948. They're opening them up. They find they're a little bit clogged up. And of course, at the scene of the damage, you've got lipids, you've got cholesterol, you've got fats, phospholipids, proteins, and all the rest of it. So they're like, oh, it must be cholesterol that clogged them up. So then they started trying to feed bunny rabbits cholesterol, and of course they clogged up because bunny rabbits are herbivores and cholesterol only comes from animal food. I mean, there were just so many errors. So sort of wind forward, and you've gone from this idea that cholesterol is the problem. Ansel Keys is the big nutritionist of the time, around the sort of 1940s, 1950s. He quite quickly said, no, it's not actually cholesterol. He tried feeding humans massive amounts of cholesterol and nothing happened. And he then famously said, look, it's not cholesterol unless you're a rabbit or a chicken. It's not a problem. And then he said, but I think it's fat. And he did that famous 6 countries graph, which everyone confuses with the 7-country study. It's completely different. So he did the 6 countries graph where he said, look, there's the relationship with men dying from heart attack, and they were aged like 48 to 50, something or other, really narrow range, and the fat intake, and I think that's it. And of course, was it Yul Shamalmy or whatever? Hillebo and Yul Shamalmy were like, no, you didn't include all the countries, and there's actually 20 countries. But anyway, that was his background. He goes into the 7-country study thinking it's fat, it's not cholesterol, it's fat.
Well, so you would have learned in your PhD research training that a more appropriate way to look at evidence is to try to disprove something. So you have you don't go into the world and find what you want and then say, see, it's what I wanted to see. So just from the beginning, it smacks of unscientific methodology.
Yeah, I mean, you get sort of taught the null hypothesis approach. So the minute you think O.J. Simpson is guilty, you look for O.J. Simpson to be guilty. So the null hypothesis says to you, right, prove that he's not guilty. All you're looking, you've got to prove that he's not guilty. And if you just can't find anything to show that he's not guilty, then he might be guilty. But don't do it the other way around, because you're going to go in with bias. So if someone had stopped me at the start of the PhD and said, what do you think you're going to find? I don't plan ahead. So you would have stopped me in my tracks. I'd be like, oh my God, that's a good question. Because I don't even know what I'm having for tea tonight. That's how little I plan ahead. So I would probably have said, oh, I'm expecting to find a relationship between heart disease and dietary fat intake in men, maybe women as well, maybe of a certain age, but I don't know how strong.
The higher the fat intake, the more heart.
Yeah, the more the heart disease. But I don't know how strong the relationship is going to be. But kind of they introduced these guidelines in the name of trying to help men with heart disease. So yeah, they must have had some good evidence at the time. That's probably what I would have said. And then the PhD, it kind of, it was done in 4 parts. So first of all, I said, right, let me pretend I'm the dietary committee back in, it was 1980 when they set the dietary guidelines for Americans on the back of that 1977 Senator McGovern work. So let's assume I'm the committee and I'm looking at all the evidence available at the time. So I want to look at all the randomized controlled trial evidence because that's going to be the best evidence. But I'm also going to look at all the population study evidence because there were some really important population studies. The 7-country study, Framingham, Wood Hill, Sydney Heart Study, Oslo Heart Study, and that kind of thing. So, there were some important ones for me to look at. And then we've got this technique now, which they kind of did have at the time, but it wasn't that well known, which is systematic review and meta-analysis. And that's the highest level of evidence when you're looking at academic evidence. So systematic review, you go through all the literature, you don't cherry pick, you just get everything, whether you like it or not, you just get all the studies, and then you pull them together in this statistical technique called meta-analysis, and out pops a result that basically is the strength of the relationship between the two things that you're looking at. So I did that, and there was no evidence whatsoever. No evidence whatsoever.
So, yeah, at the bottom of that evidence-based methodology is expert opinion, where we just kind of all know it to be true from whatever. So that's really what it was, wasn't it? So there was no, by modern day methodology, there really wasn't sufficient evidence to create this U.S. guideline.
It wasn't, and the ignorance at the time. So I remember when I was looking at the population studies, and the really big one, the one that dominated the others, was the 7-country study, because it was so big and it involved these 7 countries and 16 cohorts. And I read every single word of the 20 volumes of that study. And Keynes used to think, he would talk about saturated fat. And he was talking about, and his examples that he would give were things like cakes and ice cream. And it's like, well, they contain saturated fat, but then strawberries contain saturated fat. Not many people know that. So don't don't blame the saturated fat for what the sugar in the cake and the ice cream did. So there's just so much ignorance. And then for the final part of my PhD, I said, okay, that was 1980. We're not in 1980. I was coming up to sort of 2015. I'm going to be defending my PhD in 2016. So let's look at all the evidence that's available now. And of course, you've then got things like the Women's Health Initiative. You had the Minnesota Coronary Survey that had finally been published. And so I pulled all the evidence again, systematic review, meta-analysis, zero evidence, either in randomized trials or population studies. There is just no evidence for introducing those guidelines. None. Zilch. It's astonishing. And yet, as you say, we all know that fat clogs your arteries, fat causes heart disease, saturated fat is even worse than dietary fat. People don't even know where saturated fat is found. The ignorance, just nuts.
Well, but it's kind of like the sun going around the earth. I mean, we see it every day, right? So it occurs to me that we need to get little children in doing models of cholesterol so that they realize that it's actually the earth that goes around this sun, and it's not the cholesterol that goes on the arteries. But anyway, well, that was shocking to me as well. And I have to just mention that Gary Taubes, the first half of Good Calories, Bad Calories, was another very influential piece for me to read, to kind of, the scales fall from your eyes and you say, my goodness, there really isn't evidence for this widespread activity, which is pushing out guidelines. And it seems to, looking back, it wasn't really kind of lobbying of companies to, why would McGovern have done this? You know more about this than most people. So
yeah, I've given that some thought. I mean, when you're told something that is just wrong and for which there's no evidence, there are only ever 2 reasons for that. One is incompetence and the other is conflict. So the person telling you that information is either ignorant and they just don't know what they're talking about, or they're conflicted in some way and therefore they want to tell you something because their academic funding depends on them telling you that kind of thing. Now, I don't know. My view is, I think at the beginning, I think McGovern had gone in with his own bias. Nick Motton was vegetarian, so he was quite happy that things were tuned in.
May I comment on that? Because even to this day, those who are in the ultra low fat, so the low fat, high carb camp, the Pritikin, Ornish, McDougall, they've always said it's their way or the highway. It's the only way. So maybe McGovern was duped into thinking that this was the only way to do it. And I mean, I review videos today of that bias coming in, and then they forget to say, oh, there are a lot of ways to be healthy. Let's not make all Americans do something without some evidence before. But so I don't know. I guess I always try to see the glass half full rather, but I hate to say someone's incompetent. Maybe they're just not fully educated, fully informed.
Yeah. I mean, I think it started off as bias, the fat camp he'd been on, low fat camp. I think it started off that way, but I think big business just becomes such an issue. And of course, we've got to put this in the context of the brilliant work that Belinda Fettke has done. So she traced the whole sort of why cereals, where did that whole message come from? Back to the 1800s, 1850 onwards. So you've got John Harvey Kellogg, think Kellogg's cereals, Graham's crackers. Sylvester Graham was around at the time. And there was this whole Seventh-day Adventist movement at the time. And they really thought that men, particularly consuming animal foods, it was the height of wickedness, and they were going to become all lustful and aggressive and violent and all, if they had any meat, they were going to be these sort of evil monsters. So everyone should have cereals instead. But of course, they were developing cereal companies, so that was kind of in their interest. So then wind forward to sort of late 1970s, 1980. Imagine you're a craft, fake food kind of company, and you see that the American guidelines that are going to influence the rest of the world are starting to say, oh, I think you should be having cereals for breakfast and not eggs. And I think you should be having these low-fat, high-sugar yogurts that we can put a real high premium on rather than that nice sort of natural yogurt that comes from the farmer. I mean, you just wouldn't be able to believe it. You'd just jump on the bandwagon, wouldn't you? Right, here's a low-fat spread. Here's a low-fat yogurt. Here's a high-sugar cereal. Let's start putting nutrients in cereals and all the rest of it. And I think then it just became more and more conflicted. And what we view at the moment is it's just conflict.
The interface then between the medical world, we got no training in nutrition. And I don't know, it would be interesting to sleuth out how that changed, because if you don't have doctors trained in looking for good nutrition, they're just going to follow what everyone else does. You learn about nutrition from the TV ads, as a doctor. So the idea that this came from the government, influenced by the Seventh-day Adventists, and the religious influence is still there today. I mean, it hasn't gone away, right? So, but then how could they get so much influence? I mean, why would we have a guideline at all? My understanding is there wasn't one before.
Yeah, I mean, there wasn't. You'd have to kind of go back to World War II, and particularly in the UK, there was rationing because Europe was having a much worse time of it than the US, and the US kind of wasn't in at this stage. So ration books were introduced, and you could have a certain amount of butter and certain number of eggs and grams of ounces of sugar as it was back then. So that was kind of the first time the government said, this is what you're going to eat. But it was kind of, this is all that we can give you because we're at war and we can't get the foods anymore. We're busy making munitions and all the rest of it. So yeah, why did they even need to mandate it? I mean, there's news in the UK today that they're going to be banning smoking and banning this, that, and the other. There's part of me now just saying, look, we're grown-ups. People know the harms of these things. You can still parachute jump. You can still go off-piste skiing. We're going to take some risks in our life. Some people are more risk takers than others. And where do you go next? Do you ban alcohol? Do you, heaven knows they'd love to ban red meat and butter and cream. I kind of worry that I'm kind of supporting the smokers at the moment because I'm thinking, if I don't back up the smokers, then they're going to come for the meat eaters soon. It just has to be a slippery slope of control that I'm trying to fight.
Having been on the kind of medical public health side, we argue that if there's a small reduction of risk and death, and we multiply it over millions of people, we've saved a million lives, even though so there's always the tension between public health and personal health. And I have to say, I'm not upset having grown up with parents who smoked, and I have consequences of secondhand smoke from childhood. and that was my field. I got indoctrinated into the idea that we should tell people not to smoke as doctors. But now, you have me questioning the deep beliefs that I've known to be true forever, like, fat's bad, and now I know it's good, or it can be. The breast cancer screening, which is your current one that came out this week, might not be as great, although we have part 2 coming next week. The idea that even blood pressure treatment, to really reduce it, to reduce cholesterol really low, so this is great, but these are uncomfortable things for a doctor to learn, So the obesity, I wonder, did your brother gain weight using insulin?
No, he didn't. I mean, we came from a very sporty family. So my mum was a sports teacher. My dad was an engineer, but they both played hockey competitively. They played sport, squash, badminton.
Did your family know about the low-carb approach for type 1?
No. But the advice at the time was actually not too bad. So I remember being dragged into the local hospital. I was going back up to the shops to get some more fizzy pop, because that was the sort of the most thirst quenching for my brother. And
that would be with sugar.
Yeah, with the sugar, yeah. And I'd sort of, as I said, no sooner got back from one trip, he was sending me out on another. So I'd back out on a trip, and then I got home and there was a note from mum on the doormat saying, just had to rush Adrian to hospital. So next thing I knew, my dad was coming home early from work and he was taking me into the hospital. And then, I remember this doctor saying, right, guys, your life is now going to change. You've got a type 1 diabetic. He's going to be injecting with insulin twice a day. Your diet is going to need to change. And they didn't say low carb at the time by any means, but my parents, my roots are in Wales, but my parents had moved to the northeast at some point in their lives. And the northeast was very much a sort of high tea. I mean, the eating over there is appalling. So sort of 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you'd have Battenberg cake and you'd have sandwiches and you'd have scones with cream and jam. And it was a very sort of sweet, carby kind of meal. And the idea was that you had your sort of more main meal at the lunchtime, where you might have a stew and a meat and all that kind of thing. But, then you had all of this stuff in the evening that you probably weren't going to use up before you went and had some more cereal and whatever for breakfast the next day. So it was very much the message that needs to go. And I remember then that our meals did become more kind of what Granny would cook. It was more sort of liver and onions, fish on Fridays, roast beef on Sundays. We kind of settled into much more of a routine of, if it's Saturday, it must be curry. But it was a mince with, pineapple on the side. And it did change things. And I look back now, I mean, Adrian certainly stopped eating sugary stuff and biscuits. And my mum used to bake on a Sunday morning. That stopped. She wasn't making a couple of cakes for the week and some nice shortbread biscuits. She was a good cook. So all of that stopped. And it was very much, he really should be having 3 meals a day and he's going to inject a couple of times a day. And you really need to make sure he doesn't have a hyper or a hypo episode. And we were trained to spot the difference between the two. But then over time, as he was seeing dietitians, of course, it wasn't very long before he was shown that thing that I call the Eat Badly plate. It's the UK Healthy Eating Guide. And it's a plate that is just almost entirely carbohydrate. Spot the red meat, you won't find it. Spot the fish, you'll struggle. I mean, all the fats are polyunsaturated fat. I mean, it's just evil. But that was designed by the fake food industry, 100%. And Public Health England allowed them to do it. So that was another kind of story that I broke. I did a British Journal of Sports Medicine article when I realised where that came from. Who would design a plate like that? How could Public Health design such a bad plate? And then you realise that Public Health actually appointed industry reps to design the plate. It's like you could not make that up. I mean, that's when you know that it's not ignorance anymore. It's just complete conflict.
I went to international meeting of dietitians and nutritionists, and it was a lot of public health people, and it was so biased toward the quote plant-based thing that everyone talks today. And it was like with religious zeal, they said you couldn't have red meat, and all the terrible things. So Yeah, even you get thousands and thousands of people at a meeting, all with this belief system and bias. So from obesity, then saturated fat. In your PhD thesis, I think you kind of concluded that there was no relationship between saturated fat and heart disease or health, or what did you find?
Just nothing. So no evidence whatsoever, either at the time the guidelines were set or looking at all the evidence today. So the two guidelines are you should have no more than 30% of your calories in the form of total fat and no more than 10% of your calories in the form of saturated fat. And there was just no evidence whatsoever for either one of those. So then I would start looking at, facts about fat. So I need to kind of get down to ground zero when I do this kind of stuff. So I find myself thinking in the night of, well, what is fat anyway? And what is fat found in? And then you find, interesting little factoids. Like the only food that I can find that doesn't even have a trace of fat is sucrose, table sugar. And people say, well, that's ridiculous. It's like, okay, so go to the USDA database and put in a kilo of lettuce and you'll find that there's a trace of fat. There's a trace of fat in strawberries and apples. There's a decent amount of fat in things like grains and legumes. It starts to become measurable, let alone before you get into olive oil and coconut oil, which of course is 100% fat. So then the next really interesting fact about fat that I found was everything that contains fat contains all three fats. So you'll talk to, dietitians will confidently say, oh, red meat is full of saturated fat. So I put up a slide at conferences. So I have a sort of 100-gram piece of, you should always look at food in the raw form. So you're not factoring in cooking or anything else like that. So you take your 100-gram of raw meat and then you look at what it actually is. So then I colour 71% of it blue. So 71% is water. And then you colour 21% yellow, 21% is protein. You've got a slither of ash and minerals, that's about 1%. And then you're left with 7 percentage points, which is fat. And of those 7 percentage points, 2 are saturated fat on a typical steak that you can find on the United States Department of Agriculture All Foods database. So saturated fat is literally the last thing that a steak is. And the dietitians are confidently saying, oh, meat is full of saturated fat. So they just don't know what they're talking about. So then...
Yes, but you're like saying, well, maybe Jesus was a man. Yeah. It's like, we don't question. It's just saturated fat, right?
We don't. And then my other little sort of favourite fact about a fat is that so if you go to the food groups, so if I can remember them all, you've got meat, fish, eggs, dairy, fruits, vegetables, grains, legumes, which is your beans and pulses, and then I put nuts and seeds together. So 9 food groups there. Your only food group that has more saturated than unsaturated fat is dairy products. And then you come across all these articles written by people like Un and Mozafarian, and they say, oh, but dairy's great. We really need to worry about saturated fat, but not dairy.
Food groups is a governmental construct, right?
Yes. Yeah.
It's not like God said we have these food groups.
Yeah.
Right. So when someone says even, it's not a balanced diet, yes, it is. Well, that goes back to my background. I had a couple of dietitian, doctor, nutrition related doctors. And one of them was Jim Anderson at Kentucky, who was known as the brand man. He had people eating tons of fiber and it helped, it was not great to have. I mean, it wasn't palatable, but so I remember calling him. I then went from Kentucky to Duke to do training in clinical trials, and I called back to just kind of say, I had a couple of patients do the Atkins diet, and it really worked. What do you think about that? And Dr. Anderson thought for a moment, and he said, well, I'm not really a big fan of that diet, but it is a balanced diet. And so even a diet devoid of carbohydrate is balanced in terms of micronutrients, minerals, vitamins, and fast forward to today, Jeff Volek at Ohio State gets up and says, well, if you're doing a low carb diet, carbohydrate's not a macronutrient.
Yeah.
Because you're not eating it. So anyway, the idea that you're drilling down to the reality rather than the kind of what everyone perceives it to be. We've been drummed marketing, being in marketing, if you hear the same thing over and over, we just start to believe it, don't we?
Yeah. I'm just thinking about your plate, because the US plate, it sort of came in around the time of Obama, and you've got sort of dairy where you would put your glass, and then I can't remember the rest of it, but I think it's fruit and veg, but then it has protein. It's like, that's not a food group, that's a macronutrient. Protein is in everything other than sucrose and oils. So how does that...
Well, fortunately, it seems to me that the messaging has gotten so diluted that at least one-to-one to the end user, the U.S. guidelines kind of irrelevant, but it still has a lot of influence into the institutions, the schools, and all of these. So is there any hope to undo the idea that a school has to follow a guideline?
Well, you've got the conflict. I mean, I love that good calories, bad calories, but just the same as you did. And I remember chatting to Gary about this, and he's saying, I think he puts this in the book, if you are a practitioner and you advise a low-fat diet, you're not going to get in trouble. You're not going to get sued. Your patient might get diabetes and obesity and high blood pressure and all the rest of it, but you're not going to get sued. You were following the guidelines, but you try to do the right thing by your patient, and you end up like Gary Fettke, having a 4-year war with Australian dietitians who are funded by Sanitarium, which really does link back to the Seventh-day Adventists, because he's trying to say, don't eat sugar.
Let's shift gears. So that how did you get involved in these? I look back and there's sort of silly but epic battles that doctors outside the U.S. had. Gary Fettke in Australia and Tim Noakes in South Africa. It really kind of is silly that Professor Noakes got in trouble for a tweet, and all. But back in the day, how did you get involved in that? And to tell your version of what happened to someone who might not have been listening at that time.
So the Tim one was really interesting, actually, because he joked that it was the most expensive tweet in history. If people go on my site, zoeharcombe.com, and you put in Noakes, just put in Noakes or Tim Noakes, Prof Noakes, and there's loads of articles on there where I kind of documented the trial and I explained how it all came about. So you'll be able to see the tweet, what the person tweeted, and it was just someone he didn't even know, and he didn't even spot it for a while. So someone kind of waved at him on Twitter and said, hey, Prof, I'm breastfeeding, worried about something or other. And Tim comes back and says, remember, it's you eating it, not the baby. The key is that sort of when you're not breastfeeding kind of thing, think about low carb, high fat, something like that. Because you had 140 characters then. At the time, that was kind of shorthand for saying you're going to find the nutrients in the things that are low carb, high fat. So meat, fish, eggs and dairy, particularly the whole fat and oily fish and red meat and all that, that's where you're going to find the good stuff. So doesn't think anything of it. But it was absolutely clear that the South African dietitians, who also have conflicts with fake food, I've done a post, if you put in South Africa on my thing, it will probably come up with that one to show their conflicts. They were just looking for something. And you can imagine them in this room like, do you think this is the one? Do you think we've got enough here to go after him? They really were looking for trouble. And then sure enough, he got this complaint from this dietitian called Claire Julsin Striding. She put in this complaint, and then the wheels were set in motion, and the health professionals sort of organisation of South Africa, which was the body who regulate doctors, started getting involved, and they were looking at trying to take away his medical licence. Now, he actually hadn't practiced as a medical doctor for quite some time because he'd been this academic. He's one of the most...
Director of a... Yeah.
Yeah, he had more papers to his name than, almost nobody else in the whole world. He was so highly rated as an academic, but they wanted to go after him anyway. And what happened, Tim knew that I did these sort of dissections, and we'd met Tim. I met you for the first time when we did the Cape Town conference in February 2015, which Karen Thompson organised. She was the granddaughter of Christian Barnard, who's the guy who did the first heart transplant, and he was a sort of mentor to Tim. So that's kind of how everyone hooked up. And Tim apparently was impressed with, some of this fat stuff I was talking about in my presentation, and he used some of it in Real Meal Revolution, which was really flattering. And he realised that a paper had been written by the Cochrane group down in South Africa, that had been trying to provide evidence against him so that they could then pursue this case on the back of this tweet. So he got in touch with me and he said, "Oh, this thing has been published. Can you take a look at the paper for me? Because I need to find a flaw in it to be able to take it down because they're using it to take me down." And I remember having a look at it, and then I dropped him a note back and I said, "At what point do I stop? I'm finding so many flaws. I don't know, like, how many do you want?" And he's like, "Oh my God, this is music to my ears. Just write one of your dissections on it." So I went back and said, right, so there's 14 quite major errors. And I was back into the extraction of data from an original paper, from 20 years ago or whatever, and they didn't do that, and they should have used that number and did it. So anyway, we did a rebuttal to this paper, and then they came back and said, "We don't like your rebuttal." So we went back even stronger. And then when it got to going to court, I mean, Tim could just have backed down and said, "Look, I don't need this. I'm 60 something or whatever. I've got a lovely wife, a lovely life. I'm going to retire soon anyway." But he wanted to put the dietary guidelines on trial. And he got these two fabulous lawyers who said, "Right, we're going to do it for you on a no-win, no-fee basis. We're up for the fight." And it just snowballed from there, kind of thing. And then suddenly he was saying, "Will you come over and be an expert witness?" And then he wanted Nina to go over as an expert witness, and Karen
Nina Teichwald,
from New Zealand. If I'm allowed to tell you a little, this is quite funny. So I'd never met Nina, but I loved Nina. I loved her books. I kind of felt like I knew her, but we hadn't met. And I felt the same about Karen. So we meet. I was down there early because it was kind of when they finished interviewing or interrogating Tim, I'm going to be on next. So I kind of needed to be there for the whole 2 weeks. And every day I'm going in and I'm having butterflies and, tummies churning, thinking, "Oh, today's going to be the day." And then it wasn't. I mean, it was just horrendous. And then Nina came down at the end of the first week. So we all met for dinner that first evening. And Nina was like, "Tim knows everyone, he knows Eric Westman, he knows Jeff Follett, he knows Steve Finney, Jeff Gerber. Why is it me, you and Karen?" And I was laughing and I said, I asked exactly the same as the lawyers when I first met them, sort of, "Why us three?" We're very flattered. And the lawyer, I won't say his name, who was coordinating the whole thing, he said, "Let's just put it this way." He said, "The judge is going to be much more impressed by you women than she would be any men." I'm like, okay, thank you.
Very interesting. Well, you were the angels, right?
We were the angels, and she loved girl power. So she's running this tribunal. I mean, she turned out to be the most fabulous character. And I think I know she and Tim have now actually become friends, but at the time we had no idea. She was presiding over a completely objective, fantastic procedure. She was brutal. If anyone was out of line, our side, their side, she was formidable. But her partner was sat in the back of the courtroom each day knitting and watching the whole proceedings. And a courtroom in South Africa is not kind of like a courtroom in London or maybe California. It's not, quiet please, all stand when the judge comes in. I mean, you had people going in and out and getting a, bucket of popcorn and going back in and watching the next session. And it was just hilarious. But she, her partner was sat at the back knitting the whole time and just watching all the proceedings. So, I mean, it was just...
Well, it's important to keep in mind that this was a professional standards kind of court. It wasn't a civil, you pay money, or a criminal court where he would go to jail. It was basically battling for his license.
Yes.
Which thank you, and thank Professor Noakes and Karen and Nina for doing that. And I had that same thought. Why didn't he just brush this off? And when we were there in Cape Town for the meeting, I got to meet him and his wife. And of course, his wife was very concerned with what's my husband doing. And I had 10 years of research and clinical evidence, and then I borrowed a lot from Dr. Atkins, Dr. Eads, all these other doctors. And I have to say that it was the part of it, I think, was the personal sort of word of mouth that this is okay. This is going to be okay. Because again, it's like we were violating what everyone had taught us, and in general, doctors are pack mentality. Heard you get culled out if you're too radical in medical school generally. So, but then he got exonerated, right? It took several years.
It took, gosh, it was actually, he'd had the complaint at the time we went down for the South Africa conference, but we didn't know that then. And I think a lot of pulling the conference together was actually Karen saying, okay, the prof needs a bit of support at the moment. And then I was down there, so they'd had some hearings, then I was down there with Nina and Karen in October 2016. The judgment came out, and then of course the HPCSA, the Health Professionals Council of South Africa, they appealed the judgment. So the original panel was 5 people, so he had to get a majority. So he had to get, sorry, there's just something popped up on here. Let me move this way. He had to get a majority of the 5, so he had to get 3 votes in favour, and it was 4-1 at the first hearing. They appealed again, and of course the council could actually pick the judge, pick the panel, pick the charges, pick the venue. I mean, there was no way he should have won.
So it's like, let's have the Olympics and all the judges will be from the U.S.
Exactly. And then again for the appeal, I thought, there's no way he can win the appeal. If they can pick everyone, and they only have to get sort of 2 out of 3 this time to find against him, he's not going to win the appeal. And he did incredibly win the appeal. But the thing I would like to say actually is that, we're all really grateful to him, and he's going to put the guidelines on trial. None of us should underestimate what they went through, and particularly Marilyn, because when your husband is being attacked in that way and he's, your universe, your hero, he went through 4 years of hell, that guy. I mean, he put on a super brave face. He's talked about it in conferences since and sort of told it quite objectively and all the rest of it. Nobody should underestimate what he was going through at that time. And then the other, I'll leave on a funny note, because the other really funny thing was when we were in this sort of court session, you had a different room for each of the counsels. So we would kind of go back to the defence area and they would go back to the prosecution area. So we had these separate rooms, but we would kind of walk past the lunch to get to our room. So you go to get your lunch and then you go over to your room. And they had their high carb, low fat lunch, and we had our other way around, low carb, high fat. And they kept coming over to see what our lunch, and they were like, oh, this looks really nice, because we had...
That looks really good.
I know, ours looked so much nicer. It was all sort of, South African meats and yogurts and cheese and all the rest of it. I mean, ours was so much better. So they were all sort of wandering over and seeing what we were up to. And I think a couple of people afterwards did actually start eating a little bit more how we did, because they could, we were just walking in, we were all super slim, we were super healthy, we didn't fall asleep straight after lunch, which they did. I mean, they'd be, after lunch, they'd be like this, and then you sort of see that head jerk, and then you wake up, and we were just like energetic all day long. So we had an impact, we definitely did.
Very interesting to, Prof. Noakes, as he's called there, Professor Noakes, Tim Noakes, Noakes, for those who haven't heard his name yet, could have done anything with his life. He could have gone back to exercising and writing books on that. No, maybe it was that experience or just a new evolution. But I'm so proud that the Nutrition Network and his group came out with what is really the phenomenal textbook of carbohydrate restriction. It's called Ketogenic, and there's an egg on the cover. And, to put together something like that, it's a heroic effort. I mean, I've put together papers and small self-help books, but to do this sort of scientific, it would, what a great contribution. And I have to think that he kind of got pissed and said, I'm going to be putting together, a big book that, stick it back to them. But at the time, of course, we were all very concerned. But as I am reminded, there's no doctor in the U.S. that has been sued for promoting an Atkins diet, to my knowledge. And correct me if I'm wrong. Dr. Atkins was sued once at the end of his career, but no doctor, to my knowledge, ever since. And I'm told that it's because the U.S. system is a tort-based system. There has to be harm. And so may all the people who are harmed by a keto diet, low-carb diet, stand up, please. But if it's a professional standards board, which was, what it was actually in Australia, I believe, with Gary Betke, And with Prof. Noakes, that could happen here, I suppose. But right now, you'd go in with this. I mean, this textbook of ketogenic, it's just great show and tell. I mean, I'll come into the office and I'll go, here's the latest. I'm so proud of this textbook, and it's got hundreds of pages. Anyway, who's gonna go against that unless it's ideological, some other agenda? But for human health, wow. So Gary Fettke went through a similar sort of story. Orthopedic surgeon, got tired of cutting off people's toes and legs, and said, why do people get this? It's diabetes. Started telling him not to eat sugar. The patients, he gets in trouble there. And great that you mentioned Belinda Fettke, that's Gary's wife, who then started sleuthing out, the Seventh-day Adventist influence that even to this day influences the food in Australia. That was kind of shocking to me.
Yeah. And that was a mama bear defending her husband. It was kind of, who are these people who are going after my man? And why are they going after my man? And then she's like, they're all in bed with the cereal companies. Of course, they're not going to tell you to have eggs for breakfast.
Well, I'm so glad you explained the politics of the courtroom in South Africa, because I wondered why wasn't I called? But,
yeah, I mean, we looked, we walked in the morning. It was so funny when we kind of thought, we were trying to work out, we need 3 of the 5. Who might we get on board? And the judge, Joan, was very close to one of the other. I can't remember her name, but she almost looked like an Amish woman. And she would cycle in the morning wearing these sort of leggings and a T-shirt and had, the longest hair you've ever seen.
Motorcycle or bicycle?
No, bicycle. Yeah, and it was quite hot. I mean, it was, like 28 degrees at the time. So she'd come in and she had this, incredible hair that was all in this sort of one plait. It was all very, matter of fact and sensible, and, the flat shoes and sit down, no makeup and all sort of, be there. And we did know that Joan and this woman, it seemed very close. She seemed to value her counsel. She had a particular role on the panel. She might have been one of the legal advisors or something, but Joan certainly valued her counsel. And I can remember walking in one morning and Adam Pike, who was Tim's sort of personal lawyer, who was looking after a lot of the proceedings, we all sort of walked in, and we're all sort of looking like LA law. We'd been told, look the part, you've just got to look slim, healthy, professional, all the rest of it. So we dressed like we were at conferences. And Adam we went in one morning, he was just beaming, and we're like, Adam, what's up? And he said, have a look at so-and-so when you get into the courtroom this morning. So we're walking in, and she's not in the cycling shorts and all the rest of it. And she's got a bit of makeup on, and she's got a little nice outfit on, and, it all looked really different. And he said, if that's not you guys having an impact, I don't know what is. So we're like, okay, so we might have her. If we've got her, we might have Joan. There was a guy we knew we were never going to get, but it's like, if we got one of the other 2, maybe this is going in our direction. So
I'm glad to know that people can go to your site to read the detail of the trial. And it never was put into a movie, was it? A documentary film?
I put it, God, did they put it into it? Yeah, I think they did, actually. I did a presentation on it. So it was all done and dusted kind of thing. By the time I got to, I think it was Denver 2017. And I remember saying to Jeff and Rod, look, I mean, you've got me all the way over here from the UK. I'm going to do a half an hour on my PhD, dietary fat guidelines. Do you want a half an hour on what the Noakes trial was all about? And of course, it was the real hot topic at the time. So like, yeah, that'd be great. So if you go on the low carb down under videos, there's a half-hour video, put in my name, Prof. Noakes versus the HPCSA, something like that. And you've got the half an hour story of who was involved, what was the charge, what was the tweet, timeline, all of that kind of thing. I put it through, and I do it in quite a funny way because I'm trying to mask the fact that this wasn't funny at times. We need to look back on it.
Our time has flown. I reserve the right to call you back sometime to talk.
Absolutely.
Is that okay?
That would be lovely. That would be really nice.
How do people find you, and especially how do you sign up for your wonderful newsletter?
Oh, thank you. So my main site is my name, zoeharcombe.com, zoeharcombe.com. There's quite a lot on there for OpenView, but then I do this newsletter. My sort of how I put steak on the table is I do this Monday note, and if people want to subscribe, that's really lovely. I think it's, I don't know, £47 for the year or something. It's not even £1 a week, or like $1 a week or something. So hopefully it saves you having to read all these academic papers.
Absolutely. I use it all the time.
Oh, thank you. I'm on Twitter, or X as it is now, and that's just at Zoe Harcombe. I do tend to tweet about other things, not always just nutrition. Like, I don't know, they're talking about war all the time at the moment. It's like, would you stop it already? Nobody wants to go to war. Just, stop it. Let's go back to talking about calories and fruit and 5 a day and that kind of thing. None of this nonsense. So,
and then the book, the books you have.
Quite a few books, actually. Yeah, I mean, back to 2004. God, I can't believe my first book was 20 years ago. And they're kind of more mainstream diet books, but I'd say don't, unless you like reading diet books, don't bother with those. What do you eat? Number 1, eat real food. Number 2, choose that food for the nutrients it provides. That's going to make you low carb, high fat, because the nutrients are in meat, fish, eggs, and dairy. And that's it. And then number 3, don't eat all the time. Like, eat a maximum of 3 times a day. Dietitians tell you to graze all day long. Don't. You'll be the size of a cow if you do that. So stop it.
That's excellent advice for anyone, really. Thank you so much for your time. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, and check out adaptyourlifeacademy.com.